everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar. María Ale Andrade is Ecuadorian and has more than 15 years of experience accompanying Christian communities on issues related to faith, justice, and development. In the most recent years, she has focused particularly on environmental justice, human mobility, gender, spirituality, and decolonial theologies. Maria is a sociologist, a theologian, and a child specialist, with having undertaken studies in France, the UK, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. She currently works at Tear Fund as the Theology and Network Engagement Global Lead and serves as a board member of Bible Societies Ecuador, the Evangelical Community of Interdisciplinary Studies, and Memoria Indigena. And Carlton Turner is our second speaker. Carlton Turner, the Reverend Doctor, as many of you will know, the Canon at the moment, Canon Dr Carlton Turner, is a Caribbean contextual and practical theologian working at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, my home city. He is the author of Introduction to Caribbean Contextual Theology, SCM Press in 2024, and Overcoming Self-Negation, The Church and Junkanoo in Contemporary Bahamian Society. So please, as you're listening, if there's any questions of clarity that you need, please do ask those as well. I will understand that when we're having conversations about these themes, about global epistemologies, decolonial theology, some of the language and the ideas can be relatively new, or sometimes we use similar words and don't always think about them in the same way. So please feel free in the Q&A to ask questions, and you can jot things in the chat as you go if you like. And I'll go back through those when the time comes for Q&A.
Hi, my name is María Ale Andrade. I am Ecuadorian. Among many things that I won't mention today, I am a sociologist and a theologian. I am a curious and sometimes divergent woman, follower of Christ. And although it doesn't always work, I try very hard to be a good mom. I lead the theology and network engagement team in Tear Fund, and this is where the reflections that I want to offer you come from. I come from a land where the Bible arrived together with the sword 500 years ago, when the colonizers discovered an inhabited land with endless abundance and mines. Except that more than 60 million indigenous people lived already in Abya Yala, which today is known as America, the continent. Abya Yala comes from the Kuna people and means living land and mature land. In my land, in Abya Yala, the gospel arrived along with 3 other colonial powers. The political power represented with the queen, the economic power represented with the merchants, and the military power represented with the soldiers. So sadly, as it can sound, my indigenous ancestors did not experience the news of the gospel as good. They did experience it as blood, as oppression and death. And I am not speaking metaphorically. During the first 100 years of conquest, it is said that 90% of the population of this new continent was killed, which means something around 56 million of indigenous people. On this, Eduardo Galeano, who is an Uruguayan journalist who passed away in 2015, wrote, in 1492, the natives discovered they were Indians. They discovered that they lived in America. They discovered that they were naked. They discovered that sin existed. They discovered that they owed allegiance to a king and a kingdom from another world and a god from another sky, and that this god had invented the guilty and the dress and had sent to be burnt alive who worships the sun, the moon, the earth, and the rain that wets it. But if most of the colonial countries are now independent, why are we even talking about decolonization? And what is its relationship with theology? Why it is important for us as people who are interested in theology? But before I continue, I want to acknowledge that conversations around decolonial theology usually sounds very critical and sometimes is hard to receive, especially in Western context. So it is important to affirm that the spread of the gospel to the world through its different missionary waves did bring many good things. I don't want to deny it. However, I think that for a too long time, we only kept this victorious side of the story without recognizing the ways in which Christianity could have harmed those that we wanted to bless. So in the experience of my people, the Bible was used to justify, to perpetuate, and to legitimize the conquest. In that sense, the Bible became a tool at the service of the king. Accused of idolatry, sin, heresy, and of being uncivilized, the war against the native was biblically legitimized by conquerors like the priest Sepúlveda, using some very questionable hermeneutics on biblical passages like Joseph's context of Canaan, or the flooding, or Sodom and Gomorrah, among many others. The only experiences of divinity and expressions of faith that counted as valid became those that were brought by the conquerors. Therefore, instead of acknowledging the undeniable presence of the Spirit of God that was so hovering over the waters in these strange lands, and instead of looking for the seeds of the kingdom in these strange peoples, in their culture, in their practice, their holistic and deeply interconnected spirituality, all this was demonized. God had to be white, he had to be male, he had to be Western with all its cultural implications, or he hadn't existed at all. Of course, this is only one case where the scriptures have been used to legitimate, justify, and perpetuate epistemicide, oppression, violence, and death against those who were considered the others. Unfortunately, there are just too many cases in history that would give account of that. So although around 200 years have passed since Latin American countries fought for their independence, the effects of colonizations are still present in many ways. Latin American theory of coloniality identifies four types of colonialism that are still taking place. One is the colonization of beings, which relates of how the colonized beings are seen as inferior, which is at the heart of racism. Second, the colonization of power, which sees the power that is built on a foundation of modern colonial capitalism and Eurocentrism. Third, colonialization of knowledge, who sees the techno-scientific rationality as the highest and almost unique standard of knowledge. All the others are wisdom. They don't count as knowledge. And more recently, some thinkers are talking about the colonization of belief, which undermines the worldviews, the philosophies, religiosities, principles, and systems of life that are not based simply on Western or modern codes. All four ways of colonization, of new colonization, can be approached theologically, and they do have a theological implication. However, it is the colonization of belief that I want to highlight because it explains why Western Christianity has historically been seen as the only possible way of experiencing and expressing a truly biblical faith in the true God. In other words, colonial Christianity has permeated our way of thinking and doing mission, our way of thinking and being church, and our way of theologizing, and our way of approaching theological education as well. This is why we are often scandalized with the idea of a theology that is plural by nature, but actually we don't question the fact that mainstream theology has left out of the conversation very important voices that deserve to be heard and could have actually enriched the church in many different ways. And this includes, for example, the voices of women in a world that is made by and for men, the voices of indigenous communities who have been historically demonized, the voices of Black communities that are still discriminated, the voices of people that are living with disabilities in a world that is ableist, the voices of migrant and displaced people who are treated as illegal and who don't belong, the voices of sexual minorities who are socially condemned, the voices of white created nature who has been objectified and desacralized by humans, among many other voices. So the colonizing theology is partly a responsibility and a debt, And also is partly a very unique opportunity to enrich the Western or mainstream theology and invigorate a church that is truly global. Global not because it promotes one immovable vision of God to the rest of the world and then it becomes global, but global rather because it acknowledges, it learns, and it's shaped by different global perspectives and experiences of God. That God that is the creator and sustainer of life, all life. Personally, I have been very enriched and challenged, and I want to mention just a couple of ways, concrete ways. So while the image of God has mostly been made, it has been very challenged, but also enriching journey for me to discover the female, the maternal face of God, which is often personified in the third person of the Trinity, the divine Ruah, which is a feminine noun in the Old Hebrew, which is present in the creation of the world, which is the life giver, the life inspirer, the life sustainer, just as women are. A little bit more recently, my faith journey has led me to want to discover more and explore my own indigenous roots. And I am learning so much. I realized, for example, that while the West demonized and shut down indigenous wisdom and spirituality because it was accused to be syncretic or pantheist or wild, actually that spirituality and those values, their values, are actually much more aligned with biblical principles that our Western theology. For example, Andean perspective of the cosmos is holistically relational. Everything that God created is alive and it's interrelated, interconnected, interdependent with each other in a sort of cosmic web. You can imagine like a cosmic web where human and non-human beings are included. So the forest, the seas, the animals, the plants, all these are part of this cosmic web. This cosmic web also includes the visible beings, but also invisible beings. And it also includes the past, the present, and the future. Time and space are included in this cosmic web. And God, the divinity, is also part of this cosmic web because he's the one who weaves between its different elements. He is, through the spirit, the creator of the web, the connector of the elements of the web, and he is the sustainer, the one who brings balance between everything that exists in it. It is this like the relational keeper by excellence, just as how Colossians 1 speaks about Jesus, the relational being, the one who brought peace, who reconnected the pieces that were broken. It's a foundation for our Christology. The implications are very concrete, although it sounds like very romantic, actually, it has very concrete implications. One of the implications is that everything within this web is sacred because it was created by a God that is sacred, and also because the sacred God is present between them and weaving among them. Damaging one element of the web will destroy the balance and will affect us inevitably because we don't live in a different web. We are part of the same living system. And if one element is hurt, the whole system is hurt. I found out that this Andean worldview is actually very similar to the biblical vision of shalom, but understanding it through the lenses of the Andean spirituality, challenge my innate anthropocentrism, thinking that human beings are the best part of God's creation without acknowledging that God loves everything that he created. And this made a huge difference in my journey towards creation care. I know that I don't have too much time, so I want to finish with a poem from a good indigenous friend. Her name is Jocabet Solano. This poem is called Face of Indio, Rostro de Indio. I will read it in Spanish, but you can follow it in English. So I am going to very quickly share my screen so that you can follow it. Okay, that's the best. This is the best way I can share with you while I read in Spanish. So let's finish with this poem, Rostro de Indio. En el oro veían al indio. Rostro de indio era el oro. Oro valían los indios. El oro del dolor. Rostro de indio era el oro. Oro de la muerte. Chocaron miradas, ambos veían el oro. El conquistador veía el oro en el rostro del indio. El indio, el oro en los ojos del conquistador. Rostro de indio era el oro, oro de la ambición. Para el conquistador el oro era poder, para el indio regalo de la madre tierra. Rostro de indio era el oro, oro de la liberación. El indio gritaba dentro de sí, soy Olodule, soy hijo del oro, soy hijo de Dios. Rostro desfigurado del indio por el oro, rostro sin rostro del indio por el oro. Rostro moribundo del indio por el oro, rostro de oro el indio, oro de Dios. El conquistador vio el rostro de indio como oro, pero no vio que el rostro de oro del indio era el rostro de Dios. Thank you so very much.
I almost said thank you to her myself until I remembered she wasn't actually present here with us at the same time. But I know there is so much in there that we will have such a brilliant time discussing in the conversation afterwards. I would love to now ask Carlton to share his thoughts with us. And actually, maybe we might take a moment to just let that presentation sit with us for a moment before we add on many more things. We can just have a little pause of quiet and just allow ourselves to absorb all of what we've just heard, which has been so profound and so moving. And the lyrics are, the translation is in the chat. Thank you, Nina. If anyone would like to reread that as we just pause for a moment. Canon Dr. Carlton, are you ready for us?
I am. Yes. Okay, I'll just go right ahead. Good afternoon, everyone. And it's good to be here sharing with you from the Queen's Foundation. Let me begin by situating myself so that you get a bit more of who I am and what I do, and even why I do what I do. I'm privileged to work here at Queen's, which many of you may know, some may not, is an ecumenical institution with deep diversity across its centers, including those preparing for ordained ministry, but not exclusively. We try to model diversity and inclusion as core concepts, which manifests in how we allocate tutors, the content of our modules, the way we make space for students to have their backgrounds and identities affirmed, and in how students navigate intercultural relationship dynamics. And of course, these are not always easy, but they're crucial if theological education has any chance of fostering vocations that are interculturally competent or aware of institutional disparities when it comes to the ethnicity and culture and tradition, socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. We work hard at this, and this is not easy stuff. And when it comes to theological education, we take a long view. And the word formation for us is extremely important. We're not thinking so much about one's head knowledge, but how one exists in a world that's quite complex. So for a long time, we've been intentional about engaging with scholarship from the Global South or other approaches to theology, such as Black, feminist, Asian theological perspectives. And as far as I'm concerned, as a Caribbean contextual theologian, that particular perspective that I'll speak of in a moment. But as a Caribbean contextual theologian, I get to witness firsthand how rereadings of the history from an African Caribbean perspective have helped students to become more critical of their own naive sense of history, of culture, and of theology itself. Another example of what we do is we have a course on global theology, which allows students to deeply engage with multiple theological perspectives simultaneously. And the point is this: if ordination training itself is global, ecumenical, intercultural, inclusive in its approach, then the chances are high that our students will pattern styles of ministry that leave space for the perspectives and experiences of others who are different. So let me tell you a bit of a story. That's the Queen's context. That's where I work, where I'm privileged to work. But let me reflect on something personally, which encompasses who I am in Queens, which is also set within the larger Church of England context when it comes to UKME, GMH, ordinands, and curates. Some years ago, seven years ago to be exact, 8 years ago, almost 8 years, my official title when hired was BAME Anglican Tutor. I know there was a lot of conversations around the correct kind of title, but back then, BAME, Black Anglican Minority Ethnic and Tutor, Black and Asian Minority Ethnic Tutor. And part of my role was specifically to support UKME and GMH Anglican ordinands to be a point of contact and to be a point of contact for them and the kinds of issues surrounding that demographic within the Church of England. And over the past 5 years, and with the heightened attention that Black Lives Matter gave and the issues surrounding the death of George Floyd, I have encountered many UKME, GMH, ordinands, and curates who struggle emotionally, spiritually, having carried out a sense of dislocation for years with doubts about their ability and the ability of the COV to sustain them in future ministry. In a sense, being within the church, but feeling alien to it, alienated from within it. And some of the reasons, more specifically, a lack of cultural awareness of the linguistic, cultural, and even ecclesiastical backgrounds of the students. Curriculum designs and theological and philosophical assumptions that are monocultural and exclusive. Academic programs and expectations without adequate support for people coming from radically different disciplines and life experiences. I think we fail often when we do not account for the fact that people who come through our doors are diverse on every possible level. Also, a lack of provision of culturally competent or relatable tutorial support, and a profound lack of representation and role models within the process of training. And for me, this is one of the biggest. We cannot underestimate the value of this simple representation, embodying, being present, is often a majority of the battle. And what has become clear to me is the depth of discouragement and despair that takes place when the experiences, cultures, and identities of UKME, GMH, ordinands, and curates are dismissed, invalidated, or ignored. I've had countless conversations where I move from being the academic to being the priest on all sorts of range, just trying to be a space and place where people are heard. I think that's the broader landscape where I want to situate this talk. But recently I published my book, and I need to say some things about being a theologian living in the UK, but operating within the global South and coming from and being shaped by the global South. So my book, Caribbean Contextual Theology, please buy the book, by the way. This is the plug, buy the book. in the process of doing this book, what really helped me, it really helped me to value my non-Western context more. I had to reread the kinds of theological conversations that have been going on in the region since the 1970s. I've also had to wrestle again with the nuance and complexities of the global South that people often forget. In fact, the fact that the global South is forgotten is the problem, when it's easy to assume that these contexts do not matter. One of the biggest issues for Europe and North America, certainly in academia, is in seeing Latin America and the Caribbean as separate regions. I come from the Bahamas. That's where I was born. That's where I was raised. That's my culture. That's my context. I'm Bahamian for life. But I also trained for the ministry in Barbados, which is another Anglophone African Caribbean nation, and one of Great Britain's most lucrative colonies in what we call the West Indies. I also trained on what is effectively a slave plantation, or was a slave plantation, and has that rich heritage, that very strange, complex heritage. And in academic spaces, one of the biggest issues is that we are consistently lumped together with Latin America. Our first speaker is from Ecuador. And it's easy for academia to conflate the two. It's different histories, different contexts, similar themes. But oh my gosh, the closer you get, you see how diverse these contexts really are. So some of the things that for me stands out when I write the book and wrestle with the ideas is the complexity of the region is a theological challenge. And one of the major starting points for me is to highlight, delineate just how complex it is to define it. What do you say about Carlton Turner? I can be presenting as I am from the English-speaking church. I also speak Spanish. I grew up next to Cuba. We cannot assume that I'm not French-speaking. And in the context, you have all the world major religions present and alive in the context, in the region, all the different languages, the different cultures, different styles of government. It's a meeting place of the old world and the new world since 1492. And the result of that is a region that defies any easy description. And I think there's something deep about this defiance of easy descriptions that the global South offers for us to have to do the hard work in thinking through so that we do not label people and contexts so easily. And secondly, I try to address theological issues from that particular perspective, presenting the kinds of reflections from people who are lived in these regions. There is a wealth of theological works that have paved the way, and many people need to hear about it. For me, I'm trying to build upon a long line of people who have been shaped by plantation slavery and who continue to challenge some deeply entrenched ideas about peoples from the Americas and particularly the African Caribbean. The next thing is, I also think that we try to challenge some entrenched theological ideas based on the history of the trauma of the region. God is never a neutral or static term. And there is never one standard way of doing theology. And the region is quite unique. And the gateway to the New World in 1492, I tell people all the time, when Columbus landed in 1492, he landed on an island in what is now called the Bahamas. And he called that island San Salvador, Holy Savior. And he planted a cross. and he planted a flag. But that island had a name, and that name was Guanahani. And that's from the indigenous who were the Carib and the Taino and Arawak. And the people there who were inhabitants of that island, who were in large part exterminated because of the kind of expansion into the New World, as our first speaker was talking about. Oh my gosh, these are cosmologies, faith traditions, ways of seeing and being in the world and with the rest of nature that have pre-existed Europe by millennia. But that's not the entire, when we continue to trace the kind of theological ideas that have formed and shaped the regions after the decimation of these populations due to enslavement of one sort or another, we have the growth of a region, and just like the rest of Europe, but part of the issue was the acquisition of wealth, mostly by force, and an assault that is economic, environmental, and health. And it continues in neocolonial forms and other forms. The big question, I think, and the thing that I continuously monitor is the ingenuity of the people, because it's not just what happened. It's also the story of how we survived, continues to survive and resist in many different ways. It is a testament to a region and a story that isn't simply one of a plantation house for Europe, but one that still asserts itself in covert and creative forms, and paying attention to how people who are often oppressed and marginalized operate, survive, rebuild, reconceive, and reimagine, I think is key to a host of solving a host of the world's problems. But we need to have the capacity to listen. And I pay attention to the deep spirituality of the people of the region who have been contesting basic ideas and assumptions about church, about God, about Jesus, about salvation from the very beginning. It's shocking how historically, as a church, we have held together violent oppression and anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous approaches with some sense of a God who is love. And what I try to do, and what I often try to do, is simply open up the conversation, because these issues have not gone away, not at all. I think some of the areas that Indigenous epistemologies can lend a hand to our thinking, and I try to do this in the book in some ways, is firstly, we need to wrestle with missionary Christianity and its aftermath. This is something I devote my time and attention to. I wrestle with what mission might mean and how models of church must be constructed in light of some deeply problematic tendencies in the legacies of Christianity in the West. There's some interesting ideas that I propose and want to continually assert. I think indigenous religions, indigenous cultural heritages across the region and across the world have always been reconceptualizing the Christianities they inherited. And that's not an easy thing, but trace the culture and you can see creative and covert ways that we can learn from. But the match for these things are also in scripture. Because I think Christianity started as a movement, very much a creative process. We have this idea that I think we should capture in our world, in our church, in our theology, in our praxis. The wind blows. You don't know where it comes from and where it's going. This is John's gospel. So are those of the Spirit. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But I think we need to capture that epistemologically, or try to. I think there's something about decolonial ways of knowing and of operating in the world because of the pervasive impact of colonization of one sort or another. You look at people like Bob Marley, you cannot listen to Bob Marley as just nice, easy listening music. You have to see Bob as a place and space with an anti-imperial hermeneutic. There's no just one love. There is Babylon's system must fall. And then some of the issues that we are engaged in today, gender, sexuality, the body. I think Caribbean women theologians have been paving the way to get us to see more deeply into just how we can navigate such conversations. There is something deeply toxic and destructive in many, if not most, Western theologies around the body. And the kinds that entered the Caribbean saw no problem with brutalizing, assaulting, and raping Black bodies, men and women and children. It did not matter. And there was a problem with bodies generally. But when you start to tease out where that comes from within the Christian tradition, it alerts us to the fact that we need to wrestle with this. We don't deal with it enough. And this has implications for what we think about sin, salvation, redemption, and ultimately what it means to be a human. And our first speaker spoke about the environment. People of the global South, including the Caribbean, have implicit theologies and increasingly explicit ones that connect the land, the sea, and the people. There has to be a more connected theology at the heart of which is lament for what's going on in the world. The region that I come from is one of the most vulnerable on earth. How do you do theology in a context when you do not know if the next hurricane is going to destroy your island? That shifts the conversation totally. And often we immediately see that when we talk about theology, when we talk about praxis, when we talk about church, we don't talk from the same vantage points. Ultimately, I think doing theology from the global South, certainly the kind that I tried to model, engages experiences and perspectives that have long been overlooked and wisdom that has been available for millennia, but often ignored by the hubris of particular traditions in both church and academy. Do I have a few more minutes, Selina? Okay. And before I end with some final thoughts, I need to tell you another story. They call me here at Queens the Pocahontas. They walk around talking to me about Pocahontas. You might look at me and not think about Pocahontas, but listen, I'm a big fan. Do you remember, if you're old enough, it was 1995. You remember? I remember clearly. And Disney's Pocahontas came out. And Vanessa Williams. Oh my gosh, I was a huge fan back then. I wonder why. But she sang this beautiful song, Think with All the Colors of the Wind. And oh, I didn't know back then, because I was interested in the beauty of the movie, you know? But I didn't know back then how important the lyrics of this song were. So I kind of recapture that. But do you remember how it goes? Here are some verses. Captain John Smith meets this lovely young indigenous woman, and he thinks he knows it all, and she knows very little. And in the words of this popular song, you think you own whatever land you land on. The earth is just a dead thing you can claim. But I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name. And you think the only people who are the people who look and think like you. But if you walk the footsteps of a stranger, you learn the things you never knew. You never knew. And I think that's a key, very potent lesson for us all, including myself. So I know when I'm here singing my Pocahontas, don't judge me. But we learn so much from people whose cosmology, worldview, experiences can open up spaces for us that we never imagined could be opened up. And I think that's key to the kinds of conversations we're having about knowledge and epistemology. We assume so much. I could go on and on about Pocahontas, but here are some final thoughts for you. The discipline of theology and its assumptions when considering the insights from the global South, it's the assumptions are the things that need to be challenged. And I think wherever we are and however we exercise our commitment to theological understanding and theological truth, we must question and interrogate our assumptions. In the Caribbean, I think theology canon should be seen as an embodied process. And there are many other ways or registers that we can engage theology through. But the assumption, certainly when I trained as a priest, was that theology is a cognitive and intellectual exercise. You are good because you know stuff. What happens if I'm good at theology because I feel stuff as well as know stuff? Secondly, I think we need to wrestle with and pay respect to the decolonial agenda. Theology itself has been a carrier of colonial power relations. From Noel Erskine, Caribbean theologian, to people like Willie James Jennings, to Black womanist, post-colonial liberationist scholars, I mean, a whole list of people. Decolonial thinking is one of the tools that we can use to see how deeply entrenched we all are in a colonial agenda that is serving its purposes, and it's anachronistic. In a sense, what I'm saying is the event of Columbus's arrival to the New World is still being played out. We still think in binary ways. We still like to group things into groups and value them in terms of hierarchies of whatever value system we have. And this happens in theological education as well, the academy in general, and definitely the church. And what's frightening for me is a lot of this is very unconscious. It's just part of who we are. But the decolonial agenda makes it conscious. Thirdly, I think we need to seek opportunities to reconceive of the discipline of theology. Hermeneutics from the underside, if I may use a term, thinking through what slaves and their descendants were doing with missionary Christianity merits attention for me. It's quite a curious thing for me when we step back to see all the ways that poor, oppressed, marginalized people have been rereading scripture often much more precisely than the elite and the educated and the powerful and the rich. I think the Spirit blows, and it's been blowing outside the church for a long time. And we need to listen. In other fields of knowledge too, we need to have these conversations. And finally, this is a big thing for me. I think we have to think about process and not just product. And this is a methodological consideration. We must think that theology is a journey and a process, and and that involves the affective, the embodied, the community, the unconscious dimensions of life. And it's a creative work. But so often we want to think of a theology, a set, a doctrine, a body of regulated and highly defended teachings that become eternal. I just don't think my God is like that. What about process? How do we journey with each other into the unknown with all that we are and all the assumptions that we carried? And maybe there's a possibility of something new and liberative. And I'm not saying that's easy, but it begins by not thinking that we create something that is etched in time and whole and entire and perfect, and that's it. We're too limited in our knowledge base for that. In fact, that right there for me is the definition of idolatry. We create gods out of our own systems. Ultimately, I think scholarship from the global south reimagines theology again and re-enchants life again. And we find meaning again and purpose again and life again without the need to manipulate, control, dominate, and violently oppressed. Yes, that's it.
Thank you so much, Carlton. You have shared so many important ideas and thoughts with us in that presentation. Thank you so, so much for being with us. And I really wish Maria was here as well to thank her and to hear some more of her thoughts as well. I'm going to give you all a chance to put any questions in the chat or any comments that you might want to make. I feel like you've opened up many different themes for us, Carlton. You've talked about the ways in which global theologies really challenge our ideas of what we're even doing when we do theology. But this idea that we are almost imagining that we can define God in these limiting ways, and global perspectives are allowing us to have some intellectual humility in regard to the task of doing theology. I think you've asked us to think about who gets to do theology, who's considered to have something to teach us as we do the task of theology, and also what counts as knowledge. You know, as you were speaking, I was thinking about that. I think it's quite a Jamaican phrase, them who feels it knows it. Like I always think of it as an epistemological claim that the way that we know is not just in this rational sense, but the people who feel it, who know what it's like to experience that thing, whatever it is, have the ultimate knowledge, not those who have the theory and the kind of rational arguments about it. So much in there for us to talk about. While everybody's thinking about their questions of clarification or desires for further comment or any kind of anything that's been provoked by what you've heard in either Maria's presentation or Carlton's, and we can talk about what we heard in both. I wanted to ask a question of you, Carlton, because you spoke about theological education, and many of us are either students in different TIs, we're staff members, we are teaching theology in a different context, we're interested in theology, or we stumbled into a Zoom meeting that we signed up for and weren't quite clear what we were doing at all. But I wondered whether you might describe, to kind of pin some of this down to our contemporary context, what for you would an African Caribbean theological education look like? What would be the modules? Where would it happen? What would it actually, what are you imagining when you talk about education being decolonized?
Yeah. I think the best way, the sharpest way I can answer that, and forgive me, it's more story than anything else. But this is testimony. This is testimony time. I'm laughing because Selena knows why I'm just putting jobs at her as calling her.
Pentecostal jokes. I get this
Yeah,
all the
yeah,
time.
yeah. But when I was ordained, when I trained, this is 2002, I went into seminary. So for 20 years ago, I had one class, one class, not a module, on Caribbean theology. I'm in the Caribbean. And before going to seminary, I was a Spanish teacher. So I appreciated my sister's contribution before that. And a linguist, and linguistics was important to me. So doing things from one's social and political context, social, cultural, political context is important. And when I went to do theology, I had a very good standard classical theological education at the University of the West Indies. And I'm sorry, Selina, that, excuse my language, that pissed me off. It's the only way I could describe it. So I devoted myself and promised myself, I'm going to do a book on Caribbean theology someday. So this year was a year when that desire and fire in me was fulfilled, as in a textbook. So your question, what would it look like? It would look like a place in which you learn theological traditions, not solely from Europe, but also mediated through your own context and your own culture. I think methodologically, it would be interdisciplinary to some degree, because you cannot do theology without being keenly aware of social theory or sociology or political thought or psychological insights if you're doing pastoral theology. You must know not just England's history or English and American or European and American scholars. You must be engaged with your own. And this is why I had to go and do the research on Caribbean theologians. And I'm so glad that I did that. I did that for my PhD, and I ended up doing it. And no one can speak for everyone. I mean, that's not the goal. You're not trying to do, and that's precisely the issue. Theology needs to be more diverse. You're not trying to do it for everyone else, but for Jesus' sake, it has to be relevant to me and the way I vibe. Anyway, I have radical thoughts. I'm a narrative Caribbean person whose PhD expertise is on Junkanoo and the church. Junkanoo's Carnival Street Festival. So please don't ask me what good theological education look like, because it might look like a party. Amen. Hallelujah.
I don't think anybody would be mad at that at all. I'll read it out. European theologies are often assumed to be rational and rationalistic, but there are feeling traditions in European thought and theologies, e.g., pietism and romanticism too. How do these connect, if they do, with the appropriate attention to feeling in theology?
He always pulls me up on this very same thing.
It's a good pushback.
When I talk about European theology, whatever that might mean, there has to be nuance. When we talk about things like post-enlightenment rationalism, we have to be nuanced, because you can end up caricaturing these processes, which are also complex, in the European Academy and Church.
And and as you're saying that, I'm also thinking about, I remember reading when I was doing my research on West African traditional religions for my PhD, reading West African philosophers debating what it was to be African. But I remember reading their debate and thinking, well, if we can't also assume, in the same way that we might assume that embodiment and what you've described as this kind of epistemology is very prominent among African, Caribbean cultures and global cultures, that they also are philosophical traditions there that are about debate and rationally thinking through questions. It's not to say that they're not there.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether some of the impact of coloniality is to reduce, like you talked about the way that coloniality is reductive of whole cultures that are quite nuanced, right? And I think then maybe I've also fallen into this trap a little bit as well, is in trying to make an argument about how to include global cultures, we end up reducing them to particular traits. So we say African Caribbean culture is embodied, it's epistemologically, it's not really about the rationality of it. Well, it's like, well, there is that there. But it's that there's space for so much more than just rationality. And when we're talking about Western cultures, maybe we sometimes can be overly reductive in that direction as well and speak as if all Western philosophy is just about abstract thought and you know, abstract debates rather than thinking about embodiment and experience, when that is actually in different strands of Western philosophy as well. So I guess the warning is that even in the debate about decolonizing and inclusion, that we don't fall into the trap of being overly reductive about any particular culture, because I think that can have an unhelpful effect, I think, in either direction.
Yeah, totally agreed. And it is so easy to fall into that trap. The last thing I would want to do is to invest in a reaction to colonialism that is just as colonizing and unhelpful, if it were possible. But also the same things I challenge, that I have to also challenge in myself. I have to question my assumptions. And that ain't easy. That ain't easy.
I can't see that, but I'll just read it. Okay. I wonder whether this challenge to broaden our understanding and engagement with theology in education and formation has an earlier impact in the way the CRB discerns vocations. I.e., I sense there are large numbers of people who are gifted and called in all kinds of ways, but they both don't come forward, or if they do get called, this is changing, but it's painfully slow. Have you any views on how your thinking may assist with a more fruitful discernment process to truly reflect the diversity of discipleship? Really great question.
And I have a response. I don't know if it answers directly. I remember being involved in a piece of research on vocations, really broadly conceived, and it was some Midlands diocese, so doing qualitative research with lay people. And it became clear, and I forget the name of the research, this is some years ago, but it became clear that the whole idea of vocation itself, the concept might be clear to people who are clergy, church structures, but lay people, we use this word, but people don't really know. I don't think people engage well with what that might mean. We use the word as if that means a vocation to, say, ordained ministry within the church. But we don't do the kind of on-the-ground education where that might mean everyone has a vocation. How might we facilitate that vocation? Be that ordained or lay, academic theologian who's lay or not, somebody who is in Christian education somewhere, somehow, or leadership. We don't talk about it in ways that kind of gets the place Ray is talking about. So I think from the ground up, we have a lot of work to do. And we have a church that is very clergy-centered. I think there's a lot more work to be done. So, you know, theological colleges would be the places where you expect people to go who are training for ordained ministry. And when you have students who are independent and are just doing a degree, they feel out of sorts because, and we try to facilitate all these kinds of people. But I think it's a ground up issue.
I do think that if global epistemologies are taken seriously, it will change everything about the whole process of discernment, training, the ministry itself. and it would destabilize all of the assumptions. Even the very idea that you, in the process of discernment, there are these categories of assessing a person and their suitability for ministry that sometimes don't give a lot. I know it's literally just been overhauled, this process of what we look for. When I say we, I mean the people who discern, who decide what are the qualities being looked for in a person who they think should go forward for training. All of those assumptions, the kind of ideal priest that is in the mind of people who are making these decisions, is not going to be a woman of color from the global south, generally speaking, whose particular perspectives and interests and values might not be aligned with a middle class white person, particularly a man who's grown up in like Surrey. There's a particular priest who's imagined, who I think is shaping decisions at all parts of the journey, that I think would need to be interrogated if the process of discernment was going to be decolonized, if that's the language we want to use. So it would be quite a destabilizing process. I often say that people mostly don't want to decolonize because it costs a lot to do that. You know, Frantz Fanon said it's an inherently violent process. And that doesn't just mean in terms of bloodshed, although that has happened in national decolonization. It's about the violent reordering of power and who has a say, who has authority, who gets to decide. So it's not really it's not an easy process to undertake. I'll go back to the chat now.
I think a lot about this thing about the unconscious. I'm very interested in the intersections of psychology and theology. And I've been an unconscious bias facilitator at one point in Litchfield Diocese and do some stuff here at Queen's. And of course, like you say, it gets to surface. It attempts at something. But what we're dealing with is so deep and pervasive. You need deeper tools. And I honestly believe that the decolonizing agenda or insights from the global south, just knowing the pure impact of, say, Europe on the rest of the world is an extremely important thing. And this whole idea of, I like what Selina said about destabilizing, like it costs something, because the only way to break up those deep assumptions is to almost put you right in front of the mirror to see this is what it looks like, and it ain't pretty, and here's the impact, and here's whose blood has been shed because of it, not because of you, because of the assumptions and the systems in which we are being shaped and which we are still implicated. And I think theological education has a chance to do that, not just a course to question our biases or to help us to note our biases. I think the system itself needs to be interrogated deeply, like deeply. Why did I say I'm interested in psychology and theology? Because I think our task, if we're theological educators, is to be aware of the psychological significance of the things we're talking about. God has been a very dangerous thing for people who look like me at one time in history and even today. And not just God in general, the God that we receive, which is a version of the Christian hermeneutics that have shaped our societies. It's a deep work, and I continue to wrestle with how we do that.
Thank you, Carlton. I'm not going to chip in now because everybody's warmed up. So this last one is probably quite a big question. But as you were also speaking about these new ways of doing theology and thinking about faith, I thought, how do you reimagine when all you've ever seen is white European Christianity and theology, and that is just all you've ever known? And I say that not just for white people, for anybody who's grown up in Britain and may not have gone to a culturally diverse church context. How do you reimagine?
This is why, for me, the cross-cultural thing is extremely important. One of the things I think has blessed my life and strengthened me is just I've moved, and I had no intention of doing this. I've moved from across the Atlantic to England for postgraduate study. So I've had ministry and life in the Bahamas, and now I find myself in England. I'm very aware of being a priest in the Caribbean, being a priest here, being a theologian here, but also being a theologian there. And what a learning and a shifting I've had to do, most of which I'm not even aware of, I don't think. But I know I've had to navigate and learn and relearn and grow and do all sorts of things. And that has been a blessing, not an easy one, but a blessing. And I think that's the key. Journeying beyond your walls, your boundaries, your knowledge base. One of the things I tell clergy, who particularly curates when I encounter them, and even our students are just studying for ordination, the best thing you can do, for Jesus' sake, please, in your early ministry, go spend time somewhere else in the world where it is not your culture. You don't even speak their language, maybe, or, whatever. But go and see ministry otherwise, because you will learn more about yourself than anything else. And if I have an advice for the church and our training of clergy, please have connections. Say, I'm in the Anglican world, so have a connection around the Anglican communion that is intentional about getting people to experience other parts of the communion. That's a rich resource. And I think that's a way of building a kind of just opening up space for thinking differently. And I think those seeds, we need to be serious about that very same thing. And intentional. That's one of the things I would do. I would suggest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carlton. I think that is probably all we're going to have time for today, but I'd love to thank you, Carlton, for spending your time with us. We'll give you a virtual round of applause. And I will pass on thanks to Maria, whose presentation to us was so fantastic. And I'm sorry we couldn't thank her live. But thank you all so much for being here. It's been wonderful to have you all, and have a great rest of your afternoon.